On the 3rd of July, 1884, 4 English sailors on board a yacht, the Mignonette, encountered a terrible storm in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The storm sank their yacht, and that left the 4 of them stranded in a tiny wooden lifeboat. They had little food and almost no water, and by their 8th day adrift, they were desperate. And so 3 of the sailors made the fateful decision to kill the cabin boy, who was already sick from drinking seawater. And for 4 more days, until they were finally rescued, the 3 surviving sailors ate the cabin boy in order to stay alive. Now, when they returned to England, and the story of what they had done to effect their survival broke, as you would imagine, it scandalised the nation and it shocked the world. The survivors were put on trial, and they were actually charged with murder. One of the 3 sailors turned state's witness. 2 others went to trial, and they freely confessed that they had killed and eaten their crewmate, and their defence was that they had done this out of necessity. Now, here is an interesting thought experiment for you. If you were the judge in the Mignonette trial, how would you have ruled? What would your conclusion have been? Because after all, the story and the defence that the sailors made, that we did this for necessity, it really leads to 2 possible conclusions, doesn't it? The first conclusion is a purely utilitarian one. 1 person was killed, but 3 people survived. And the cabin boy, unlike the 3 older men, he had no wife, he had no children, no dependents, so his death left, nobody destitute, just some sad family members. Now, I suspect many of you, most of you, I hope, listening to this would go, well, that's an outrageous conclusion. It's utterly irrelevant that, the 3 other guys were able to survive because they killed him. You can't behave that way. And most of us would have a visceral reaction that would say what those 3 sailors did was abhorrent, utterly wrong, fundamentally wrong, because they violated the cabin boy's dignity, his human rights, his value, his worth, and so on. And you see, what's interesting is whether it's a small crime against humanity, the murder of a cabin boy under desperate circumstances, or whether it's a major crime against humanity. In recent decades, we've had the Rwandan genocide. A little bit further back, you might have the many millions who were killed in Stalin's Russia. You might have the way that ISIS in recent years have behaved, raping and murdering across the Middle East. Whether it's a small crime against humanity or a bigger one, all of us watching this would probably have the same reaction. We would say that it's wrong, that it's evil, that it's unjust to violate the dignity of another human being. And of course, that fundamental belief, that powerful belief, is enshrined in these powerful words from the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights that underpins much of what we believe about human rights today. Let me read you some words from the preamble to that document, which says that the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace in the world. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And of course, in today's 21st century modern world, we are passionate about human rights. We award Nobel Prizes for them. In fact, we even build museums to them. I lived for 6 years in Canada, and in Winnipeg, in Canada, the Canadians have built the World Museum of Human Rights. Incredibly beautiful building with amazing exhibit after exhibit, celebrating all that human rights has brought to civilization around the world. But for all of this, for Nobel Prizes and awards and museums and everything else that's gone on, a fairly basic question is sometimes overlooked. These rights, these human rights that we speak of, this dignity that we believe that human beings have, where is it located? What does it depend upon? Because however noble those words and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights sound, are they actually true? To illustrate what we're kind of dealing with here, let me engage in a little thought experiment this morning to show you the problem we're facing. So imagine that we were to draw a circle. And in that circle, this circle represents the DNA, the genomes of every living thing on planet Earth. Every living thing is in that circle somewhere. Everything from amoeba to ants to aardvarks to lettuces to human beings to politicians, they're all there in that circle somewhere. Now, when we talk about human rights, what are we actually doing? Well, what we're actually doing is we're coming along and we're drawing a smaller circle inside the big circle, and we're saying if you live in this small circle, if you are human, then you have a special dignity and a special set of rights that doesn't belong to things outside of that circle. And that's what we've done. We've drawn a smaller circle inside the big one. But now here's the problem. Along comes the white supremacist, utterly racist, abhorrent human being, and what he does is he draws a smaller circle inside our already small circle and says, no, dignity and rights only belong to a smaller subset of the human family. Now the challenge is this: both of us have arbitrarily drawn a circle. The slightly bigger circle of human rights is arbitrary. Why pick only humans? And of course, the racist is also arbitrary. Why pick only white Europeans? But we've both arbitrarily drawn circles. Why is one of those circles commendable? We award prizes and so forth for it. And why is the other one absolutely condemnable? Well, as you try and, pardon the pun, square that circle, there's only a very limited number of options. First option you might lump for is you might say, well, human rights exist because human rights exist. They just do. They just exist. And you can't ask why. And bizarre as that sounds, many people do sort of effectively end up in that position. A few years ago, I had the privilege of debating one of the world's leading secular rights campaigners, Peter Tatchell, who has been campaigning for human rights and especially LGBT rights for decades. Peter's an atheist, he's got no religious faith, and in that debate we did, that was basically Peter's approach. He said, well, rights exist because they exist because they exist. Well, the problem, of course, is not merely is that circular. It goes round and round in circles. If you take the route of saying we have rights because we have rights, we have rights. It's also it gets destroyed pretty quickly when you either meet somebody who just outrightly laughs in your face and says that's nonsense. And so, for example, the atheist ethicist Peter Singer, another chap I debated a few years ago, and Peter's argument was human rights don't exist. And if you asked him why, he would say they just don't. They're nonsensical. And so he would laugh in the face of this. But also, of course, the racist can use exactly the same argument as this on the slide here. He can claim to be superior to other races, and we say, well, why are you superior to other races? He can go, well, I am because I am. So claiming we have human rights just because we have human rights is a massive issue. It just doesn't work. It's a total non-starter. Okay, what next? Well, maybe we can find something special about human beings. Maybe there's something special about us that mean we have, human rights and dignity. Maybe it's the fact that we have speech, or consciousness, or moral agency, or folk music, or something. Maybe there's something about human beings that sets us apart from the rest of the natural world. Well, this approach, although maybe initially it sounds promising, it fails for a reason that yet another atheist, Sam Harris, again, no Christian faith at all does Sam have, but he has identified that there's a massive issue with trying to ground human rights this way. He says, look, the problem is that whatever attribute we use to differentiate between humans and animals, be it intelligence, language use, moral sentiments, and so on, will equally differentiate between human beings and other human beings. If people are more important to us than orangutans because they can articulate their interests, well, why aren't more articulate people more important still? And what about those poor men and women with aphasia? It would seem that we have just excluded them from our moral community. So the problem is whatever you go for and says this makes human beings special, then the problem is the same thing can divide human beings up, and we end up saying some human beings have rights and some don't. Total nightmare. Well, now our options are getting more limited. Maybe we say, well, hang on, maybe human rights and dignity exist because they matter to me. We live in a world where everything is about my feelings, right? Well, okay, I feel that human rights are important, therefore they are. Well, that's all very well. But the problem is, again, that we end up again sort of stuck, because when someone like Martin Luther King cries out, I have a dream, we can just say, or someone can say, well, I'm glad you do, mate, but I don't. And the problem is about human rights and dignity, we need more than personal preference, because it's not enough for me to say, I believe in human rights, I need to be able to compel others to believe in human rights. And the best I can say is, well, I feel this way, therefore you should equally feel this way. Again, doesn't really get us anywhere. And really the last option we have here for finding some kind of basis for human rights is to appeal to the state. Maybe we say, well, okay, human rights exist because the government grants them. But the problem is, as we know all too well from politics, is that if rights are something the state gives, then rights are something the state can take away. And this is seen in history, tragically, time after time. For example, in 1857, an African-American slave named Dred Scott sued his owner for his freedom in what became a really, really famous and important legal case in United States history. Tragically, the United States Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, ruled against Scott. And the justices in that decision, they argued that because he was a Negro, he simply didn't possess rights. He had no such thing as rights in the first place. Now, you hear a story like that, and you go, and if you want to go and read more, you can Google the Dred Scott decision, and you can read what the justices said. But you read a story like that 150 years on, and you wince. I wince with embarrassment at how our ancestors behaved. Yet all the justices did in that ruling was they drew a circle. We're back to circles. They just drew a circle, and it was just a slightly smaller circle than the one that most of us today would draw. But it's nevertheless an arbitrary circle. So do you see, we have a huge issue. We want to affirm human rights. We bang on about human rights all the time around issues of justice. We want to talk about human dignity and so on. But how do we find a basis for human dignity and rights? What is the foundation? And reflecting on that massive challenge, the Australian atheist philosopher Raymond Gaitard wrote these words. He said, "We may say that all human beings are inestimably precious. We may say that they are owed unconditional respect. We may say that they possess inalienable rights. And, of course, we may say that they possess inalienable dignity. But in my judgment, he says, these are ways of trying to say what we feel a need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources we need to say it. Be that as it may, each of those statements is problematic and contentious. Not one of them has the power of the religious ways of speaking." So how do we solve this problem? How do we solve the problem that so many of us in our society, we are committed to human rights, but we can't ground human rights? Well, maybe history can help us here. So in 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas and Spanish colonization began. And it was not long into that period of history before reports of Spanish mistreatment of natives there in South America began to spread more widely. And in December 1511, on the island of Hispaniola in Monday, Haiti, a Dominican friar named Antonio de Montesinos preached a sermon, firecracker of a sermon, attacking Spanish policy towards the natives. He laid into what the Spaniards were doing to his native people. Well, word of that sermon and word of the atrocities that were being committed reached the King of Spain, who, faced with horrific testimony about what his subjects were doing over on the other side of the world, convened a group of theologians and jurists and tasked them with developing law to govern how the Spanish colonists behaved and stop this kind of mistreatment. Well, chief among those theologians and jurists that the King of Spain gathered was Father Francesco de Vitoria, today, in fact, considered by many people to be the father of international law. And Vitoria argued that all human beings, every human being, is equally free, and every human being has the right to life and culture and property. Similar arguments were advanced to the other side of the world in the Americas by Bartolomé de Las Casas, who today is considered a saint throughout Latin America for his work trying to build a foundation for fair treatment for native peoples. And then finally, there was Francisco Suárez, whose 1610 essay on the laws argued that all human beings have rights because they have been endowed with them by their creator. If human beings are God's special creation, then that gives a spectacularly strong grounding for human rights. And it's interesting how history plays out, because Suárez's essay influenced John Locke. John Locke, in turn, influenced Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson built this idea right into the US Constitution with its idea. It's teaching that all people are born equal and free in life and liberty and so on. Now, notice something in this very brief history I just gave you there. All of those thinkers who laid the foundation for human rights. We forget that modern human rights theory didn't sort of fall from heaven, in 1948. It's got a long history. But these thinkers who formed the foundation and others, they were not moralizing in a vacuum. They weren't pulling the idea of human rights out of a hat like a conjurer producing a rabbit. Rather, they rooted their idea in the Christian belief that human beings bear the image of God, an idea that is unique to the Bible. You will not find that idea that human beings bear God's image. You won't find it in Islam, nor in Hinduism, nor in Buddhism. It's an idea. It's a uniquely Jewish Christian idea derived from the very first chapter of the Bible, where in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, we read these verses. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. The impact of these verses, as I say, has been terrific in history as Christian thinkers and jurists and others influenced by them built on this idea. And this is pretty widely, I wouldn't say universally, but pretty widely acknowledged, even among those who don't share my Christian faith. For example, one of the most influential French atheist philosophers writing today is a chap called Luc Ferry. A pretty hardcore atheist. He's written a book called A Brief History of Thought, which is a survey of sort of philosophical trends through the ages, and he makes no apology for being an atheist in that book. But in that book, he makes an interesting remark. He notes that in the Greco-Roman world, in the classical world, it was taken as a given that some people were inferior to others. In fact, in every ancient civilization, from the Greeks to the Romans to the Persians to the Muslims, the list goes on and on and on, it was taken for granted that slavery was perfectly okay. It was perfectly okay to enslave others. But then, Luc Ferry says, something happened. He says, in direct contradiction to the Greek world, Christianity introduced the notion that humanity was fundamentally identical, that all men and women were equal in dignity, an unprecedented idea at the time, and one to which our world owes its entire democratic inheritance. But this notion of equality did not come from nowhere. In other words, he's saying, if you took, the greatest of the classical Greek things, if you take an Aristotle, you've taken Plato, if you go back to the ancient world and taken any leader back then, grabbed any man or woman that's on the street at random in the classical world and gone, hey, is slavery okay? They'd have gone, yes, of course it's okay, because, some people are more important than others. It's obvious, right? But Christianity, Luc Ferry, the atheist, says, turned that whole idea upside down and says, no, everyone is equal. But where does that idea come from? Of course, it came from the Christian worldview, and it came from the Bible. And it's massively easy to forget the difference that a worldview makes. We are so historically unaware in the modern world, we forget that ideas have a history. And one of my political heroes has long been William Wilberforce, the anti-slavery campaigner who was instrumental in helping see slavery abolished throughout the British Empire and also throughout the great powers of Europe in the 19th century. But as Wilberforce's biographer, the modern politician William Hague, points out, Hague says, we now take abolition for granted. We take it for granted that slavery is wrong. But we forget that every civilization once had slavery. The Europeans, the Greeks, the Persians, the Arabs, the Muslims, the Romans, native peoples in North America enslaved one another. Every civilization that anthropologists know of seems to have had slavery. But something caused Wilberforce and those other abolitionists to think differently. And we forget what it was at our peril, because it's not clear that the flower of human rights that grew from a Christian soil, that the flower of human rights that grew from a Christian understanding of what it means to be human, it's not clear that you can take that flower and it will thrive elsewhere when you cut the roots off and reject the Christian faith from which it began. You know, as one of the most influential atheists of all time, Friedrich Nietzsche, massively influential atheist thinker, put it. He said, the masses blink. The masses blink and say, we are all equal. Man is but man, but before God, we are all equal. Before God? Well, this God has died. In other words, Nietzsche had no time for the idea that all people are born equal, because he saw that once you throw God out, then human equality quickly follows. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have a choice. We could adopt a Christian understanding of humanity, that we have real value and real dignity because we are made in God's image. Or you can reject that narrative, ignore the consequences, and refuse to answer Nietzsche and just pretend everything's okay. But one last thought for you. If human beings have dignity, and so on, you know, as I've just argued, why should that affect how we behave? This is another question that isn't often thought about or talked about when we talk about human rights today. You know, suppose after, you know, watching this talk, you're out for a walk in your town or city, and a passerby, pokes you in the eye, trips you up, and steals your coffee. Hey, you cry out in protest. How dare you? I have rights. I have dignity. And what would you do if that person turns around and says, yeah, so what? How can you compel us? And they go on and they walk off with your coffee. Which is a good question, right? You know, just because you have rights, how does that change how somebody else behaves? And you see, the thing is, you can't talk about rights without also talking about responsibility. We love in our culture today to talk about rights, but we also need to talk about responsibilities. What are our responsibilities towards a fellow human being, towards a dignity bearer? And more importantly, why do we have responsibility? Well, that question opens up a whole new can of worms. Not least, it opens up the question, is there a way that we are really supposed to be? Are some actions really, really wrong? And are some actions really, really right? Well, listen to the words of Harvard University law professor Michael Sandel, one of the most well-known thinkers writing today on issues of justice. His little book, Justice, from which this quote comes, is an incredible overview of the various attempts to answer those kind of questions through the ages and why they fail. He has no faith, as far as I'm aware. He's an agnostic. I don't think he's either doesn't believe in God, but hasn't rejected God either. But the conclusion he comes to at the end of his great big survey of different attempts to sort of solve the problem of justice is interesting. He writes, look, he says, debates about justice and about rights are often, unavoidably, debates about purpose. Despite our best efforts to make the law neutral on such questions, it may not be possible to say what is just without arguing about the nature of the good life. In other words, he's saying, unless we figure out what life is for, what the good life looks like, what it is we are designed to be, we cannot answer questions about justice, and therefore we can't really talk about responsibility, and then rights goes out the window as well. You know, it's an interesting question, isn't it? What kind of creatures are we as human beings? You know, where is the compass of our souls, as it were, designed to point? Are we creatures designed? Are humans designed to be creatures who should seek justice, goodness and fairness? Or are we just a primate that got lucky in the evolutionary lottery and whose genes are purely directed at reproductive success, and quite frankly the only thing that matters is that we survive and reproduce? Many atheists, again, as we've seen through this talk, realise there are some huge problems here. John Gray, very well-known British atheist, says modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind sees evolutionary success, not truth. To think otherwise is to resurrect the pre-Darwinian error that humans are different from all other animals. Of course, I would say, John, actually, I think that pre-Darwinian idea that we were different from other animals is actually, in fact, correct. But John is absolutely right. If the best we have is evolution and natural selection, then truth and justice go out the window. See, only if we are made for something can we talk about things like responsibility, about a way that we should live. For example, if I was to complain to one of you that my watch is a bad watch, you know, I bought a watch from the jewellery store, and they sold me a bad watch, and you say to me, well, Andy, why is it a bad watch? And I say, well, I was trying to hammer in nails using my watch. I hadn't got a hammer, so I thought I would use my watch to hammer in nails with, and I broke my watch, and it's a bad watch. I suspect you would probably take me gently to one side and say, Andy, look, the purpose of a watch is to tell the time. And we decide whether a watch is a good watch or a bad watch by how successfully it does that. It's purpose, do you see, that enables us to tell whether something is good or bad. It's purpose that enables us to say whether a watch is a good watch or a bad watch. So what about us? What about human beings? What's our purpose? Are we just an accidental collocation of atoms, to quote the atheist Bertrand Russell? Are we just tormented atoms in a bed of mud, as the writer Voltaire famously put it? Are we 1% bits of pollution in the universe? Are we robotic vehicles just genetically dancing to our DNA, or any other one of 101 other misanthropic atheist answers? Or, in contrast, is the Christian story true? Because if it is, we were made with a purpose. We were made for something. We were made to discover God's love, to love God in return, and to love our neighbour. And if Christianity is true, then love is the supreme ethic. That's what it means to be human. Love is the fundamental building block of the universe. That's what it means to be human. And that gives an oughtness and a purpose to human life. Raymond Gaita, the Australian atheist I quoted earlier, actually recognised this. And he writes that for all the talk of human rights and dignity, his human rights and dignity is best derived from the unashamedly anthropomorphic character of the claim that we are sacred because God loves us, his children. Raymond sadly doesn't believe that's the case because he doesn't think God exists, but he recognises that claim at the heart of Christianity, that God loves us, that we can be adopted into his family, is the best foundation for human rights. And as a Christian, I would agree. I think human rights can only be grounded if love is the ultimate reality, the supreme ethic built into the fundamental fabric of the universe. The gentleman on the slide here is Maximilian Kolbe. Maximilian was a Polish Catholic monk, arrested by the German Gestapo in 1941 in Poland for his work engaged in human rights activism. He was sheltering Jews and other refugees from the Third Reich and helping smuggle them out of the country to safety. Well, after the Germans arrested Kolbe, he was shipped to the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp. 1 year after his arrest and internment there, a prisoner escaped. And so to deter, this made the authorities very angry, and so to deter future escape attempts, the deputy camp commander announced that he would pick 10 men at random to be locked up in an underground bunker and starved to death. He had all the prisoners gathered in the prison yard, and he began to read names out at random of those who would be sentenced to death by starvation and dehydration. When one of the men whose names was read out at random heard his name, he began to cry out hysterically, as one might imagine. He began to cry out, but my wife and my children, what will become of them? On hearing those cries, Maximilian stepped out of the crowd of prisoners, looked the commandant squarely in the eye, and said, "Sir, may I take the place of that man?" The camp commander agreed. The other man was released back into the crowd of prisoners, and Maximilian was led away with those 9 other men and locked up in that underground cell where they were left alone in the dark, without food or without water, and left to die there. Why did Maximilian do that? Why did he act that way to help and show such love to a fellow human being? Well, of course, he was a Christian, committed Christian, and he too believed that love was the supreme ethic, and it compelled him to act. He was acting on the words of Jesus, who said, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And of course, Jesus demonstrated this himself when he went to the cross on my behalf and your behalf. And that's an important point to land on as we bring this in for a landing, because if we say that human rights only works if God exists, that then raises the question, which God are we talking about? Because not every view of God is the same. But in Jesus, we have a God who looks very different. See, human rights only works if humans have value and dignity. And value is an interesting word to think about, because economists will tell you that something's value is determined by what somebody is prepared to pay for it. So, for example, I paid several £100s for my iPhone here because it's very valuable to me that I can make phone calls and play computer games while sitting on the toilet. So this is, very important to me. But imagine you take this iPhone here and you take it to a desert island where there's no cell phone reception, no mobile reception, and there's no power and no Wi-Fi. It's probably worthless. Probably no one's going to give me any money for it. It might make a nice chopping board for shellfish or something, but it's not going to command that kind of value, because value is determined by what someone is actually prepared to pay. Well, if that's the case, what's the value of a human life? Well, of course, Christianity says that God is willing to pay an incredible price for each one of us, the price of his Son, Jesus Christ, as it says in Romans 5 verse 8 in the New Testament. And if that claim is true, that means I have value. It means you have value. It means that every human being has value. It means that humans have dignity. They have worth. And on that basis, you can talk meaningfully about rights and about responsibilities. Otherwise, all you have are noble sounding words, but ultimately just hot air. It's the biblical teaching that human beings are not cosmic accidents, that we are made in the image of God, gives us a foundation for human value, a foundation for dignity, a foundation for justice, and so on. But in closing, it also offers a powerful explanation of something else, why our world and why our culture often look the way they do, why there is so much injustice everywhere. Because you see, one of the challenges for secularism is to explain why it is that human beings go wrong in so many ways. For all the talk of technology and economics and politics and education leading us to a secular utopia, that never seems to materialise. Indeed, as the poet Randall Jarrell once wrote, he said, most of us know now, actually, that Rousseau was wrong. That man, when you knock his chains off, sets up the death camps. Soon we shall know everything the 18th century didn't know, and nothing that it did, and it will be hard to live with us. We instinctively know this is true, I think. But why is it true? Why is it true that we are often so beastly to one another, that despite all the technology we have in the 21st century, we can still behave in monstrous ways? And after all, if human beings are made in the image of God, as I've been asserting, why are we so often beastly to one another? Well, it might be helpful to reflect just for a second on the nature of the word image. You see, inherent in the word image is the idea of reflection. Earlier this morning, before I sat down to record this video for you, I angled the shaving mirror so it reflected my image accurately. We judge the quality of a mirror by how well it reflects a likeness, how good a likeness it produces. And when the mirrors go wrong, of course, we tend to sort of reject them, right? In fact, shortly after the launch of the Hubble Space Telescope back in 1990, NASA had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on repairs when it turned out the main focusing mirror in the Hubble Space Telescope was slightly misshapen and it was producing poor images. So built into the idea of image is the idea of reflection, which means if human beings were created in God's image, one thing that means is we were intended to reflect God into the world, to reflect God's glory into creation. And thus the question for every human being becomes, well, what do you choose to reflect? See, all of us angle the mirror of our souls at something. And if it isn't God we are reflecting, it's going to be other things: work, performance, money, image, or even, heaven forbid, we risk becoming like the Narcissus of Greek legend, so totally obsessed by ourselves, gazing at our own reflection, lost in wonder, our own cleverness, beauty and reputation, that we ignore everything else. But the thing is, if you do that, if you angle the mirror of your soul at those other things, those things will ultimately destroy you. If you try and make career or money or family or sex or success the ultimate thing in your life, it will destroy you, because a mirror cannot be the source of its own light. So what is the solution? How can we deal with the fact that the mirror of our souls is cracked, broken, distorted? Well, the biblical theme of the image of God that we saw in Genesis chapter 1 actually runs through the whole of the Bible, and in the New Testament we find the answer to that question in these words found in the book of Colossians. where the Bible says, "For God has rescued us from the dominion of darkness, and he's brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." The Son is the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn over all creation. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things in heaven or things on earth, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. See, according to the Bible, Jesus Christ was the perfect image of God. Totally perfect, no, not marred in any way. But as the perfect image of God, he was nevertheless still willing to be trampled on and rejected and broken for us, that through his death and resurrection, for those who place their trust in him, that our broken image might be remade, forgiven, and restored. The story of Jesus' death and resurrection are at their heart all about restoration, the promise and the power to restore the image of God that we have allowed to become so broken and so twisted in us. See, if all we had of the Bible is Genesis chapter 1, we would know that human beings are unique, and we'd know we have value and dignity, but we'd have no way to get back to that image that we've obviously fallen so far from. But thankfully we don't have just Genesis 1, we have the whole of the Bible, and the Bible tells the whole story. The story of what God has done about that problem in and through Jesus. And so Christians have a hope. A hope not for what God might do, maybe one day, but a hope founded on what he has done in Jesus, in the true image in the cross. Human beings are not just atoms. We are not just matter, but we do matter, because we are more than the stuff of which we are made. We are more than our economic production. We are more than our relationships. We are more than our biology, more than our psychology, more than our gender, our sexuality, or our race. We are image bearers that bear incredible value and significance. Value so high that Jesus was willing to pay the price of his life to redeem and restore that broken image, so that the mirror of our souls might be angled at him and reflect the true image of God as it was intended when God created us in the very beginning.